Hey everybody, it's Matt Aguilar here. Thanks for coming on to another episode of Old Scribes. My partner in crime, George Willis, not here today. He's out cruising somewhere, out on a cruise. But wish you were here, George. But mostly we wish you were there, wherever you are. Today we have somebody who I've been wanting to have on for a long time. I admire his work. He's a real boxing guy, real sports writer. He writes for Boxing Scene, Ring Magazine, and the Ventura County Star. Francisco Salazar, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
So yeah, we were talking a little bit before it started about you're a teacher full time and you're also a soccer coach. So I think we were saying that last day of school was just yesterday. So how's it feel to be out of school?
Relieved, sad to see some seniors graduate, but time to recharge and go back at it 2 months later. But it's relief when you submit final grades and turn them in and leave campus for the last time for the school year.
So how long have you been a teacher?
I'm in my 22nd year in the classroom.
Okay.
I started March 1st, 2004, and been a high school coach for baseball and soccer almost as long, boys and girls soccer.
And yeah, and your soccer. So talk about that. You how long have you been a soccer coach? Did you say?
Through the district, probably almost as long as I've been teaching. Boys and girls soccer, where I teach at Channel Islands High School, South Oxnard. And I just finished my 8th year as a varsity head coach at Windham High School, which is down the street.
So how'd you do this year?
A little short of expectations. Finished strong. Just we didn't quite click the way I wanted to. But the important thing is I saw 8 seniors graduate yesterday, and that's what's important. We're scholar athletes, and we teach them to be responsible in the classroom. Then they could be athletes. But we have high expectations for next year with the good core group players I have coming back. So expectations are going to be high. The players I've been getting feedback want to play to the best of the ability and hopefully go to playoffs this year, coming season.
All right, sounds good. So now, were you a journalist first before you were a teacher, or were you a teacher who kind of does the reporting stuff on the side?
A little of both. I started with Fight News in 2000, actually 25 years ago in May. And then I began teaching March 1st, 2004. So while I was getting my teaching credential, I was started in boxing, and that's when I started with Fight News. And then in 2012, I went to Boxing Scene, and then a year later, I started writing for Ring. And then maybe before that, I started writing for the Ventura County Star newspaper. So it's been some years. I've been in the earlier part when I started with boxing, I did more boxing, and I was finishing up school, and then it went hand in hand with boxing and teaching and coaching at the same time.
And so how did teacher schedule is? I come from a family of educators, so I know exactly what your schedule is like. Especially with being a soccer coach. How do you find the time to do anything on the side besides have a drink?
I sleep less. Sometimes I need to kind of not sort of put so much emphasis on the writing. I need to kind of step back. But priorities with the family. So I haven't been writing as much, but at the same time, that's a good balance. You don't want to sort of overdo it and then kind of not pay attention to your family. I have a wife and 2 kids. So, but there's times when when I wrote more consistently, sometimes I would have to write 1, 2 in the morning, and then I would then get up early sometimes, maybe write another story. But overall, I just was very consistent with my first priority was family, then teaching, grading, agenda, weekly planning, and then the writing would come after.
That's crazy. That sounds like a full plate. Um, Now, did you go to school for the education piece or the writing piece or both?
I guess it went hand in hand with both. I got my bachelor's degree in history, and then got my license to teach. And then the more I did the writing, and more with hand in hand what I learned about the writing aspect from history. So that's one thing I stress to my students: to write and to explain, to be thorough, to be a critical thinker. And at the same time, I was able to, on my end, develop sort of a writing style, and from there, I just really sort of took off with the writing with boxing. And as much as sometimes you balance, sometimes when you're in class or sometimes when you're writing, you're like, wait a second, I need to do this for history. And then when you do something for history, wait a second, I need to write the story before I forget.
Right. And so, besides, we know all about your boxing background. You're one of the best ones out there. So, talk about your what else you cover at like the Star, or what other sports do you cover? Certainly not your soccer team.
Yeah, that would be a conflict of interest. But I just mainly boxing. So right now for the Ventura County Star, anything that's local, that's connected to the area, to the 805. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of stuff from Robert Garcia or fighters that he trains, Fernando Vargas, his sons, Callum Walsh didn't being junior middleweight. He just moved to Ventura, so been writing more stuff about him. And then nearby is the Chumash Casino Resort. So anything that sort of revolves around boxing in the area, or events happening, or things going on in the area, especially with the fight card later on this month at the Chumash. The Star likes the coverage. They really, really now see the real connection with boxing in the area. Actually, Rogelio Romo, and Fernando Vargas's half brother, he coined the term Boxnard. So it's Oxnard, but then he was the one who coined the term Boxnard. And it really is, whether you see kids get into a fight on campus or in an alley or where the gyms in Oxnard. I mean, it's boxing has really become synonymous with the city, and vice versa.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because I have years ago, before Oxnard was known, before Vargas came along, La Colonia, all that. Um, I went to like a cousin's wedding, and I stayed in Oxnard, and that weekend was like the Thomas Hearns Virgil Hill fight. So like, I made my dad like drive all over Southern California to try to find a place that I could watch Hearns versus Hill. And he found like this sports bar in like Simi Valley. But had
Okay.
we known, I'm sure had we looked a little more in Oxnard, we'd have found a lot of places, but we just didn't know the area. And that was pre GPS. That was like 1991.
That was Thomas Guide.
That yeah, that's right. That's right. So yeah, that was it was. I always found it like years later how it was kind of a little ironic that Oxnard became, it has now become a boxing hotbed, and not just for a minute. I mean, that is one of the more talented stables in the sport for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if it's not fighters who grew up in Oxnard, like Robert Garcia and Fernando Vargas, Jose Aguiniga, David Rodella, Mikey Garcia, Victor Ortiz, and Brendan Rios, they moved from Kansas to Oxnard and they made their pro debuts here. But there's fighters from Ukraine, there's fighters from Lithuania, there's fighters from Russia. Off the top of my head, obviously the more well known Vasily Lomachenko, Alexander Usyk, he's trained in Oxnard. Mean Machine, Egidijus Kavaliauskas, he's trained here, lives here in the area. Alexander Vostik. I mean, you name the fighters that not only grew up here but migrated here. And I've always said that Oxnard is like the United Nations of boxing, because it may be fighters who grew up here and they come from a Mexican American background, but there's also fighters from all walks of life, from Europe, from Africa, and Asia, and then they just made their home in Oxnard. And then you ask these fighters, why did you move to Oxnard to train? And they love the weather. You could run on the beach. You could go run in the hills above Ventura. And that's just the great thing about this area of Ventura County. The weather's great for most of the year. I mean, you could go hike in the mountains above Ventura and Ojai, and then come down to the beach later on in the day. So it really is quite a unique aspect of just here in Oxnard, where you could just train and enjoy the scenery, but at the same time, there's less distractions in Oxnard unless you want to have a nice Mexican meal.
Yeah, right. You can overeat there, right? Um, uh, I did find it interesting years ago when Lomachenko versus Mikey Garcia was probably one of the biggest fights in boxing, right? About 10 years ago, it was the fight we were all hoping we would see because they were two of the best pound for pound fighters in the sport, and I did find it interesting that both, either at the time or a little bit later, they were both living in Oxnard, right? I mean, they were.
Yes.
Here was the biggest fight in the sport, one of them anyway, and they were both living in Oxnard. I thought that was very interesting at the time.
Yeah, so both lived and trained in Oxford, and then recently Lomachenko bought a house in Camarillo, which is where I live. So not only would he actually live in Camarillo in an area called Spanish Hills, but then he would drive to Oxnard. But then what he did recently in the last couple of years was he had a gym built at his house, and so he would live there and then walk, steps away to his gym, and that's where he would train. And then Mikey recently moved from Oxnard, and he moved to in Moreno Valley, which is on the other side of Los Angeles. But yeah, that's a fight that we never got to see. That would have been very just what could have happened. It was a fight that was very technician versus technician, two very highly skilled fighters. It's too bad that we never got to see that fight, especially with so much connections with, at one time, both were promoted by Top Rank, both living in Oxnard, and then the connection it would have been a really great fight to promote here in Southern California, and it's just too bad that we never got to see that.
How do you think that fight would have turned out? Both,
Wow.
both in their primes.
Both in their primes were excellent technicians. I mean, what I admire both is that they both, their skill set, their just ring generalship. Gosh, it's really like splitting hairs, only because Mikey has maybe the advantages with the distance, height. Lomachenko having won 2 gold medals in the Olympics. Southpaw, but then Mikey Garcia's seen every style. I mean, you would think Robert Garcia maybe has the edge over Anatoly Lomachenko, even though Anatoly was at one time the Ukrainian national boxing coach, having trained Usyk and having trained Gvozdyk. Boy, I don't know. I mean, it's just one of those fights where the best man win, and I really couldn't pick a winner because each brought something to the table that was an advantage, or at least a compliment to each other, and how both would, sort of bring out the best in each other.
Well, Loma just retired, like yesterday or today. I can't remember, but
yeah, the announcement was today. Yeah,
it was today, I think. I mean, there's a lot. Twitter is always the platform of extremes, or X.
When is it, right?
Right. It's either all or nothing on social media, and it's either he was the greatest, he was one of the greatest of all time, or he was overrated. There's no in between. I tend to think, and I posted this today, I tend to think that he was really one of the better fighters of the last generation, probably a first ballot Hall of Famer. I mean, he won a world title in his third pro fight, fought for a world title in his second pro fight. So, I just feel like, when you talk about greatness, it's more than just names on a resume. It's about, it's more nuanced than that. It's about who he beat at the time, how he did it, the impact it had at the time. And there's a lot of criteria that goes into greatness, but I think he definitely fit into the greatness mode. What do you think?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head because obviously he had the pedigree with being a two-time Olympic gold medalist, and I thought that the fight against Gary Russell Jr. in his third pro fight, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Russell may not have, it may have been the favorite going in, the betting favorite, because Lomachenko was coming off a split decision loss and had a 1-1 record against Orlando, had lost against Orlando Salido. And I
Hmm.
think Lomachenko was like the B side of that fight because Gary Russell at that time was promoted by Golden Boy, and it was a Golden Boy show at in Carson at the StubHub Center, now
Hmm.
Dignity Health Sports Park. We would call it, sports fans and riders call it, the War Grounds. But I remember being there ringside, and I just said, Lomachenko is a more polished fighter, and going in, I just thought that he had the tools, and I thought that maybe too many people were looking into the fact that he lost against Salido, and it was a fight that's really a toss up. It depends on what you liked, whether you thought Salido was a more effective fighter or Lomachenko was a more effective fighter. But um, after that, the way he would just dominate and he fought solid guys. He fought Jorge Linares, who many had pegged as the at that time the lightweight champion,
Hmm.
and he fought and beat respectable, decent guys. And I don't remember him ducking a fighter. I know fighters ducked him.
Yep.
And I mean, I know people are saying, well, he had three losses, but there's one loss that, and I even mentioned this on social media. There's one loss that he like really. I mean, it's a good loss. It's against Teofimo Lopez, because that loss looks better and better every time that Teofimo wins. And the Salido
Yep.
fight, again, it's a toss up. And then many people think, more in the majority think, that Lomachenko did enough to beat Devin Haney. I did. I had Lomachenko winning 115, 113. So it
So did I.
really, yeah. So it really depends on just how you look. But you have to give Lomachenko high praise for winning world title belts at three different weight classes. The way he won, the way he never ducked anybody, and then in two of those three fights, it could have been a case where he actually won. So I mean, I think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. Deserves being a first ballot Hall of Famer, and the way he was able to just fight as long as he did, and maybe when he beat Cambosos in his last fight, you kind of saw maybe the resignation, like, you know what, I'm 36 years old. I've done this for a long time. Remember, he had 400 amateur fights, only lost once, and in that fight, he actually got his revenge. But after a while, it's not so much the physical toll, but it's the mental toll, the getting in shape, training, the running, the mid work. After a while, your brain hits a limit. I think that's when he mentally just checked out and said, you know what, I had a great career. It's kind of hard, difficult for people to get a world title shot, but for him to fight, win world title belts at three different weight classes, I think he, has that right to say it's enough and move on with his life.
Right. Although he didn't hit a wall like Donald Curry did, I do think that Don Curry from the '80s, he was the best fighter in boxing for a long time, or not
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, for about a year and a half, and then he just hit a wall, and I attribute that to, he was 404 as an amateur. It's like, yeah, he may have only had, 26, 27 fights as a pro, but as an amateur, that's a lot of fights. And you're right, it's more than just the physical, although that plays a big part as well. But it's also the mental. It's the an entire lifetime spent of, waking up, at 5 in the morning, going for doing your road work, eating right, living a Spartan life, and that's tough to do for over a long haul.
Yeah, and keep in mind, Matthew, there's some fighters. I mean, we don't know exactly how Lomachenko's training schedule was, but I mean, we've covered this for long enough to know that there's some fighters that train twice a day, maybe train in the morning or train in the evening, or maybe they go 6 days a week. They'll train Monday to Saturday. People like Oscar Valdez. I mean, look how he's really not maybe at the elite level with Lomachenko, but I mean, Valdez always trained, and he had to have his trainers and manager Frank Espinosa really tell him, you need to stop training, because after a while your body just takes so much. I mean, yeah, you want to sort of be at your peak and train and spar, and but at the same time, even the amount of sparring you get in the gym, or even in the amount of road work, it takes a toll on your body. And after a while, your body isn't what it used to be, and then you start sort of slowing down. You can't let go of the punches that you did when you were 5, 10 years younger. So again, it's maybe at that time when Lomachenko said, "I'm not at that peak what I once was." And I think if this is his way of walking away, he walks away with a sound mind and a healthy body.
And you could almost see it, after he lost to Haney and he kind of broke down in the dressing room. You could almost see that, like, he had poured everything he had into that fight, into preparing for it, into the fight itself. And whether you win or lose, and mostly when you lose, when you pour that much into it and it doesn't turn out your way, it's debilitating.
Oh yeah, it really is, and it's like it goes back to the mental aspect, and maybe part of that is the rationale you mentioned, but also the fact that maybe Vasily was convinced he did enough to win, and maybe just hearing the judges' scorecards, maybe that emotionally got to him as well. On top of the fact that just the mental aspect of what you mentioned, allowed him to break down. I mean, it was a moment that was magnified over and over by naysayers and people who are fans of Vasily, but just when it's sort of like a taboo thing, like when fighters show emotion. Oh, well, that's not being macho. But at the end of the day, you could look at any fighter, and when they show emotion, it's really something that just demonstrates just how much work they put in and the amount of work that they put in. And it's so much, like as I mentioned, just the mental aspect of boxing as well.
It's kind of like what Larry Merchant said. I think it was probably during the Barrera Morales fight. He said they're emptying themselves, and that's exactly what they do, right? They empty themselves in the gym, in the ring, and then when that fuel tank says empty, it it says empty, right? Whether it's physically or mentally, but there's only so much. It's the roughest sport around. There's only so much fighters can take.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right.
So, how did you get interested in boxing?
Wow. So I was a boxing fan. My dad, my late father, he was a big boxing fan. So my dad was just an aficionado of fighters, and I'm sure these are names that you'll recognize besides Julio Cesar Chavez. But my dad was a big fan of Ricardo Finito Lopez. My dad was a big fan of Rubén El Puas Olivares. My dad, Vicente Salivar. My dad just, yeah, he grew up in rural Mexico. He grew up, and then coming here to the United States. I mean, my dad just really loved boxing. If it wasn't boxing, it was baseball or lucha libre. But I made a point about this in social media. But my not just was my dad a fan of fighters from Mexico, but my dad was a fan of boxing. And then my dad was a big fan of Sugar Ray Leonard. My dad was a big fan of Larry Holmes. My dad was just a fan of boxing. My dad really enjoyed just watching boxing. And so I remember I'm sure you remember this, the ABC Wild World of Sports on a Saturday. So I remember my first, maybe I was 11-ish when we saw, and my dad really got a day off from working the fields on Saturdays, but it was a ABC Wild World of Sports. It was the Evander Holyfield Dwight Quali fight, the first or second fight. I don't really quite remember, but just watching that, and then that got me hooked. And then obviously the Mike Tyson fight against James Buster Douglas. And I remember going to work with my going to the field to work with my dad. And I remember something like maybe it was like 5 o'clock, and my dad, we can't miss the fight. And then my dad was like, "Oh yeah, we have to go." And I'll never forget this. My dad, who didn't think that Mike Tyson was going to win early against James Buster Douglas? And I remember my dad saying, "I'll take a shower after the fight," because my dad probably thought the fight was going to go past the fourth or fifth round. And then you're seeing how the fight is playing out and how Douglas is winning. And then the eighth round when Douglas gets dropped, and then later in the 10th round, the way that James, knocks out Mike Tyson. But that was the fight that got me more into boxing. And later on, I stumbled on Fight News, and then I made contact with Scott Pope. He went by Flat Top, and then I got my opportunity to write, and then I just wrote and wrote, and I just really put my name out there. But I've always been a boxing fan, and if I'm not writing on it, I'll watch boxing. I could watch a fight on Facebook. I could watch a fight on Pro Box TV, or a card on ESPN on Saturday, and then tomorrow there's fights on the Zone. So I really am a boxing fan at heart, and I really enjoyed the nuances of the sport. And for me to be a part of the sport, as far as a scribe, as far as a reporter, I enjoyed, and I really just lived through the moments. Just and Dan Rayfield, he says it best. Like the moment right before a major fight in Vegas, that moment right before the bell rings, that's just like there's no moment like that in sports. And I really just gravitate to it, because it really just, having seen the sport for 25 years up close, it really is a joy to cover, whether it's a 4 round fight, it's a main event fight in Vegas, or it's a fight on ESPN or whatnot. It's really a joy that I get from seeing the fight game up close and personal, and interviewing the fighters and managers and promoters.
That is one thing I do. That I always thought was very special was this relationship with you and your dad. I mean, I think a lot of us can relate to that, because it was the same with me and my dad, and he remains a big fight fan, but that's the first time that I remember starting to watch a fight and seeing the gloves and seeing the blood and seeing it just draws you in. But I think your story with your dad is just great, in that you have so many special memories built around the sport, and it just that's what you have, right? That's what's so special to you.
Yeah, I mean, my dad's not around, but I know that he just, if it wasn't for my dad, I mean, it's cliche to hear this, but if it wasn't for my dad, I wouldn't have gotten into the boxing. And I know that, in his last couple of years, he would still watch a good fight, or he would, tag along. And I appreciated the promoters. I would ask, hey, can my dad have a credential? Can my dad have a pass? And I never expected, from promoters, if they could, great. If not, I know I would go and even sometimes buy my dad a ticket. But I really saw my dad really just enjoy boxing, because he enjoyed it so much as a fan, watching on TV. Here in Southern California, it was always on Channel 5 with Jimmy Lennon Sr. as a ring announcer at the old Olympic Auditorium. So I
Hmm.
remember when Golden Boy was nice enough to give my dad a ticket. I mean, it was, all the great fights and all the great fighters that fought in that venue. But for my dad to actually see a fight, that really meant a lot. And I know my dad was not a very expressive person, being that he was a macho man from rural Mexico. But just I know that my dad really just enjoyed the sport a lot. And then some of the fighters and people like Bernardo Osuna really liked to talk to my dad, and it was just really great to see how um, my father just got great joy from watching it over the years, whether it be on TV or now in person. Or I just know that my dad had a really good satisfaction knowing that I got great joy, and I enjoy watching the great fights that take place on TV.
That's great. That's great. So we fast forward from the past to the present, in terms of the old, some of the fighters that your dad liked. Now we look at some of the, the boxing scene now. What is your take on the sport now? It's changed a lot in the last year, 2 years. It's not exactly the same sport that your dad was used to, that I was used to, that you were used to, and we watched it going up. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it is different. What is your take on the current state of the sport?
So it's sort of like a mixed bag of positives and negatives. I mean, we grew up at a time when we saw boxing on network TV. We saw it on ABC's Wild World of Sports. So we would see it on NBC. I think NBC, like in the 2000s, pushed boxing, and then we would see boxing on CBS. And then we would see boxing on ESPN and the premium networks with HBO and Showtime. I don't think no one ever thought watching boxing on in the 80s and 90s thought about watching boxing on a phone. Like people would be like, "What? My gosh, what are people thinking about?" Carrying a phone and on watching boxing or something called YouTube or something called the Zone. But that's where we are today, and it's a great aspect because now you have promoters, and I'll give you an example. So Thompson Boxing, Ken Thompson recently passed away, but Ken Thompson started Thompson Boxing. Ken Thompson was he owned numerous building material stores here in Southern California, and he thought, hey, I'm gonna put my hand in boxing, and so he would promote shows in Ontario and Corona here in Southern California. But then he had great people that worked for him, like Alex Campanovo. So he would eventually start streaming fights on their website or on their YouTube channel. So I've always felt that boxing, whether it be promoters or in itself the sport, changes through the times, and whether you could now stream fights on YouTube or you could stream fights on Facebook. But now you can magnify that with big companies like the Zone, and now ProBox TV has gone to streaming fights as well on YouTube channel. So it's great to see that a diehard or a casual fan could see boxing in any way, shape, or form. But unfortunately, with so much of the sport now sort of digitalizing, now we've seen HBO exit with boxing, and now Showtime's exit with boxing. And then now we're seeing ESPN possibly airing their last fight card on July 26th.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the negative aspect of boxing because now you might not see boxing on network TV like you've once seen before. So, it's great to see variety, but at the same time, now that we're seeing the emergence of Turkey, and now you're seeing, major fighters or elite fighters fighting once a year because they want a big, big payday, as opposed to the fighters like Ray Leonard and Thomas Hearns fighting 5, 6, 7 times a year, where they stay busy in between fights and they don't balloon up 20, 30, 40 pounds, and then they stay active. So it's some sort of a mixed bag where you're seeing boxing available through a library on ESPN, or you're seeing boxing where you can watch it on YouTube or it's streamed in some fashion. But unfortunately, the fighters that you would consider elite fighters aren't fighting as much as they should. They're fighting once, maybe twice a year, as opposed to the fighters like Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran. And even Oscar De La Hoya, back in 1997, Oscar De La Hoya fought 5 times,
Yep.
fought on HBO pay-per-view and fought on regular HBO. And it's almost like now taboo where some fighters think that, oh, well, I got to fight on pay-per-view and I got to fight on pay-per-view. I'm unbeaten or I have a world title and I should fight on that type of platform, as opposed to staying active and being active and seeing, fans, or having fans see you consistently and often, and you're more like now considered an afterthought because you're only fighting once or twice a year, if that. So that's sort of where we are now. Could boxing improve? Obviously, it could, but it just depends on who wants to invest in boxing and have it more consistently, and if we're able to have more platforms, and if there's networks that actually that are able and want to actually invest in boxing for it to take place on a more consistent basis.
Right. Right. Um, and so, also this weekend is the Boxing Hall of Fame. Have you ever been?
No, that's on my bucket list. I want to go. I want to go this year, but then I just, there were things taking place. Like my wife, she got her bachelor's degree, so she took a lot of classes at the last minute. But that's something that I want to go at least next year and the next following year. But it's something that I really want to enjoy. I'm a history person, so
Right.
anything with a boxing Hall of Fame or history or anything that's tied to history with the sport. So I'm going to try to make it a point to go next year, or no later than 2 years, but something where, whether fights in nearby Verona or fights in that area where I could enjoy the fights and also take part in the ceremony with the International Boxing Hall of Fame.
Right. Yeah, I've never been either. A couple of years ago, I was going to go, ended up going to the Boxing Writers Banquet instead in New York City rather than. I guess I could have done both, but I didn't. But that is on my bucket list as well. And the last question, because we've all been this is speaking of the way things have been, this has always been the case. But um, why do we keep getting scorecards like in the Resendez plant fight? No matter what the fight, no matter what the venue, no matter what the commission, no matter what the state, there's always at least one scorecard that makes 0 cents. Resendez clearly beat Caleb Plant over the week. I had it 117, 111. That might have been a little wide, um, but Judge David Sutherland scored it 115, 113 for Plant, and you had a post on X that was very similar to one that I put out there and then many others. Why does this keep happening? Is it corruption? Is it blindness? What is it?
Maybe it's a combination of different factors. I mean, David Sutherland just did not have a good night, and we're seeing it more magnified more so in the last year or two, where one scorecard just does not reflect. And we were quick to, pick on Guinadere or Adelaide Bird, and in this time we're getting, or Waleska Roldan when we scored Horn over Pacquiao back in Australia a couple of years ago. But now we have David Sutherland, and in recent years he's gone scorecards that just scratch your head. 115 more than 13 for Caleb Plant just did not reflect that fight whatsoever. That scorecard did not reflect that fight. If I'm not mistaken, David Sutherland scored round 12 for Plant, a round that clearly Resendez won. So I mentioned on X, either he inadvertently uh, uh, scored fights in the wrong corner, which I've heard from judges and officials it could inadvertently happen.
Right.
I've heard something to the effect of like, well, either maybe it's a predetermined scorecard, he missed a good fight, or the invisible hand.
Yes.
And it's just you can't understand just how, in what way he was scored a fight that way. And it's unfortunate in that you're seeing that aspect of boxing that shouldn't take place. And I've always said, if you want boxing to really, 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 sorry, my son flushed the toilet. If you want to see boxing
I'm used
be
to that.
taken seriously, yeah, and we're not used to that, right? If you're seeing boxing, if you want to be taken seriously, then I've always considered or proposed you need to have commissions sit down with these judges and say, okay, can you please explain your scorecard? Because you don't hear about judges being reprimanded. You don't hear judges or in any way, shape, or form. You see them again the next weekend, or you see them again on the next big fight, scoring another fight, and then you get the likelihood of. So I spoke to a manager in the last couple of years, and it's a manager we won't mention. When not mention the state either, but when there's judges or officials, this boxing manager says absolutely, I do not want this judge. And obviously, judges, state commissions have the final say, but it's really unfortunate that you have judges that sort of play a part in something that shouldn't happen. And if you want to have the sport have more clarity, if you want to have the sport be taken seriously, where you don't have casual fans, or you don't have any fan mention the fact, well, that judge had it in for him, or that judge doesn't know what to do. Have commissions and executive directors sit down and explain just why, in what way, shape, or form they came out with that scorecard. But unfortunately, in Nevada, you're not going to have that, because in Nevada they protect their own, and it's unfortunate because, and we've been around long enough, Matthew, where Nevada used to sort of be the example, where you had the set of judges or the set of referees, and now it's like you're bringing in referees and officials from New York State or from California, and unfortunately, you're wondering like, wow, it's Nevada's sort of taking a nosedive now. And here in California, I've gotten used to seeing a really good state commission. It's not perfect because of how they ruled the Emmanuel Navarrete Charlie Suarez fight and the result, but at least you've seen some accountability with executive directors like Andy Foster. But unfortunately, in Nevada, there's no sort of penalty, there's no punishment, or uh, there's no way you could hold judges accountable, because the same thing, at least with other sports, like with baseball, media gets quotes from an umpire on why he called the strike 6 inches out of the strike zone. With basketball, okay, why was that not traveling, or why their real interpretation? But as far as like judges, in a sport where there you see the name of the judge, or there's a judge with a scorecard aligned where it's is not reflect the fight, there's no accountability, and there's you state commissions don't make that judge available to talk to the media. So where's the accountability?
Right.
And then in the future, you get unfortunate situations where another David Sutherland bad scorecard, or another Valesco Roland scorecard, or an Adelaide Bird scorecard, and then unfortunately that really hurts the sport in a situation where the sport already sometimes has negativity to it. So hopefully there's more accountability, and hopefully there's more, but at the same time, I'm not holding my breath.
I remember in 1990, after Chavez Taylor, they interviewed Richard Steele in the ring about his decision. You know, like, and Steele had to sit there and explain, his actions, and that doesn't happen anymore, and that's a shame. Because it kind of seems they can, whether it's the ref or whether it's the judges, they can kind of turn in these scorecards, and there's no, like you say, there's no accountability. They don't have to answer to anybody, and they're right back in the same seat, a week later. There's apparently no penalty for a bad scorecard. It does seem like there is something going on where I remember Teddy Atlas explaining one time that it was like this silent agreement between judges and promoters or whoever, not necessarily promoters, but powers that be or sanctioning body heads or officials, and that if they scored for fighter A, they would get another assignment, right? So if they didn't score for them, they wouldn't get an assignment. So there's this nothing has to be said, but there's this silent understanding of like, okay, if I judge for this guy, I'll keep getting work.
Yeah. And just real quick, didn't mean to cut you off, but it's more like, as my dad said, it's money. It's all money driven, unfortunately. Sure. And it's unfortunate had Rescindi's not gotten the decision, because again, maybe one of the other two judges, and they're actually really good judges, Max Zuluka and Steve Weisfeld, were the other two judges that had Rescindi's winning correctly. But maybe what if they had a bad night, or it wasn't one of those two judges, and they had supported also a plan, we would also, and then we wouldn't also be talking about this situation. I think also in Mexico last Friday on that Matchroom boxing card, there was also a fight where one judge, or the judges, had the fight scored for the other fighter who should have lost, when the loser should have been actually the winner. Yeah. And to piggyback what you also said also is, it's unfortunate that it's a good topic. It's a great water cooler topic, but in an age when we should talk more about the best fighting the best, and X fighter X fighting Y, it's unfortunate that we're drawn into talking about scorecards. And I also mentioned, when you mentioned Teddy Atlas brought up a National Boxing Commission. If there was a National Boxing Commission, I know that there is the ABC commission, but at the same time, would a National Boxing Commission address the aspect of discrepancy with scorecards, where state level they don't do it? So right. That's also something to kind of talk about, or maybe Teddy Atlas was right all along, where we could have a national commission, and then we wouldn't be talking so much about the David Sutherland's posting or submitting bad scorecards. Right.
Yeah. It's been an issue since we started covering the sport, and before that, it's always been there, and it's frustrating that nobody can clean up. And I understand about bad nights, like for the Raleigh Romero Ryan Garcia fight, I usually, the bigger fights I'll score round by round online. I scored it for Garcia. I don't know. Maybe it was a bad night. I don't know. There was so little action going on in that fight that it's hard to say. But my thinking was, well, at least Garcia was jabbing. To me, that was
Mhm.
more than what Raleigh was doing.
Mhm.
And so, I got roasted for my scorecard. So I can understand a bad night if that was indeed a bad night. But some of these judges have bad nights a lot, and this one in particular was not even as egregious as we've seen, but it was pretty bad.
Yeah, and unfortunately, if there's another big time fight in Nevada in the next couple of weeks or months, we might see David Sutherland again at ringside.
I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will. All right, Francisco, I could talk to you all day about this, but we should probably go eat and take care of our kids. So
Yeah,
thanks a lot for coming on.
everybody
It's
somewhere.
yeah. Uh, Thanks a lot for coming on. Like I said, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I'm glad we finally did, and I hope to see you at the fights one of these times again.
Well, the pleasure's mine. Thank you very much for having me on. It really means a lot talking boxing with you. If George Watt isn't on his cruise, talking boxing with him, but it's really much appreciated, and thank you. And yes, if not for boxing, we'll meet up sometime, and it's a pleasure. And it's really great to see you still be involved in the sport. You're a great asset to boxing, Matthew.
Thank you. So likewise. All right, we'll talk soon.
Thank you. We'll talk soon. Take care.